Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. This is the Instructional Design and Learning Community of Practices webinar series. And today we have a real treat because we get to hear from Jamye Sagan. And she's going to tell us about how her cats helped her quickly develop training materials. Jamye is a STC All-Star, I think. She's on so many different committees. I think she says yes a lot. Jamye's a popular summit presenter, and we're really glad that she's doing an encore version of this session, which she presented at STC 2020. So without further ado, Jamye, tell us more. Make us smart.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Vicki. I'm here to share with y'all. I love cats. I love technical communication, and what better way than to combine the two. So I wanted to share with you some tips on how my cats help me quickly develop training materials. So keep in mind that these are for quick and dirty training classes. These aren't for huge curriculum-based items, but this is just for if you're tasked with, I need to create something on the fly. So just a little bit about myself. Those are my cats. My husband had commissioned a painting of our 6 cats, 3 that were in heaven and 3 at the time that were with us. We have a 4th one now. So I work for H-E-B Grocery Company based out of Texas. I work as the communications advisor for pharmacy. So there I get to manage the communications between the corporate office and the stores. We have about almost 300 pharmacies, so we have to communicate information to them, and especially with COVID-19, there's been a flurry of information that has changed or changes over time. So I help manage that and help create training materials when needed. And I'm a member of this community of practice. I also belong to a few others, and I'm currently a member of the South Central Texas chapter, where I'm currently the vice president. So I'm looking forward to working with the chapter, and I volunteer with the IDL COP as a treasurer, and I also work with surveys and social media. So for you members, we have our demographic survey out. So we've extended the deadline to this Friday, so if you have not yet completed it, please go ahead and do so. And if you complete it, you could be entered into a drawing for a $25 Amazon gift card, one of 4. So we want to incentivize you to share your information with us. And I love knitting, and I love cats and technical communication and training, but the knitting and cats don't really go together because our cats like to play with yarn. So during this talk today, we'll cover 9 steps for assembling a basic training course from start to finish. And within these 9 steps, I'll share some photos and a little kitty tale. I'll also offer some food, which will be our discussion on the topic. And then finally, I'll scatter some kitty treats, some tips and reminders regarding the step. So these are the different steps. First of all, we've got to prepare for the new arrival. This is gathering your information. Keeping your eyes on the goal. This is defining your learning objectives. And we're going to discuss all of these in greater detail. Don't worry. And keeping things simple because cats don't like to wear hats. Taking small bites. Don't gulp down your food. This is basically chunking your content to make it more digestible for your learners. Step 5, prepare for change. This is where we'll talk about updating your curriculum, updating your course materials, and who's going to handle that and how. Step 6, embracing playtime, digging right in. This is where you develop the course, and I'll give you some suggestions on activities that you can do. Step 7 is practice, 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 giving your learners an opportunity to practice what they've learned. Step 8, we'll talk a little bit about feedback. To love and praise, but use the squirt gun when necessary. Now, I don't recommend y'all actually use squirt guns if you're teaching in person or online, but it kind of works wonders with cats if they get on the counter or wherever they're not supposed to go. And finally, take a cat nap, rest, but remain alert. And in this section, we'll talk about actual feedback for the course itself. That way, you know what needs to be updated or improved. So without further ado, step 1, prepare for the new arrival. So these are all of our cats, and this is the newest one, Piggy Jr., the one with the orange hat. So whenever we introduce a new kitten to the household, we take basic steps to eventually introduce them to the rest of the house. So for the first week or two, the kitten will have full reign of the spare room, and they'll have their food and water, bed, toys, and litter box. And I'll leave a towel where the kitten can deposit its scent, and then I'll do the same for the other cats throughout the rest of the house. And then I'll swap towels. That way they get used to each other's scents. Then at the end of the period, I'll bring the kitten out in a large cage. I have one of those big dog cages for frequent supervised visits with the other cats. And so once after a little bit of hissing, they'll get used to seeing each other. And then I'll also have supervised visits with the other cats in the kitten's room. And this takes a few weeks, but eventually the kittens will have full reign of the house with the cats. And this has worked really well so far because the cats generally get along. And in fact, today Piggy marks a little over a month of having full reign of the house along with his 3 brothers and sister. So preparing for the new arrival. So how does this relate to training? First of all, you have to have your learning plan. So you get your request to create an ad hoc training course. So the first thing you want to do is to gather your basic project information. So you want to create a learning plan to determine exactly what you need to cover in this training, as well as basic course logistics like deadlines, deliverables, and such. Now, this needs not be formal, but I recommend this be written for later reference and records. So even if it's summarized in an email, that's fine. It's savable and it's written. So basically you want to capture your topic, your audience, your deadlines, what deliverables you're going to use, and your delivery methods. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. And how do you remember how to get everything you need? Think about the 5 whys of journalism. So you want to gather information for your learning plan. And how do you do this? The 5 W's. Who, what, when, where, and why. So going with the who, there are 4 different people or audiences that you have to consider. First of all is your audience. Who's going to take the training? Who's going to receive the training materials? Your SMEs, or your subject matter experts, are the people that you're going to ask for information. They're the ones that are going to have that knowledge about whatever it is that you're going to train your users on. Your stakeholders are the ones that own the project. They're the ones whose approval you need to implement the training. And finally, updates. Who's going to be in charge of updating the course? Most likely it's probably you, but if it's not, then you need to decide who's going to be responsible for maintaining the course so it doesn't remain static and stale. Next, we cover the what. What information needs to be covered? And of course, you discuss this further as you're developing the course, but you basically need to know what it is you're covering. And most importantly, what format will your deliverables be in? Consider what media is available to end users. So for example, if they don't have internet access, unless they have standalone devices, you can't depend on the internet to deliver your items. Or if it's something that it's just easier to have a piece of paper or a laminated sheet, you can go ahead and do that. But just consider the format of your deliverables and how people are used to taking in the information. And the when, you need to know when training takes place and their associated deadlines. So my big question is, when do folks need to be trained? You want to ask that, and you go back from there. So you want to consider the time for course materials to be uploaded to any sort of learning management system if you have to track. You also need to consider time for any testing of the materials. This pilot testing can be as simple as letting a member of your target audience review what you have. I mean, it doesn't have to be formal, doesn't have to be fancy, because remember, this is quick and dirty information materials. You also want to consider time for your stakeholders to sign off on your project. You also want to consider time for you to make any changes if you have to, and time for your subject matter experts to give your information. So you need to consider all that. But the main thing you need to focus on is when do they need to be trained, and then work back from there. And your SMEs and your stakeholders will help you determine that. And the where in-house training going to be delivered? We're not necessarily talking about a physical place like a training center per se, but it could be, on the job, if you're doing on the job training, or if they're going to view the module or video at home or wherever they happen to be. You want to keep that in consideration. And the big one, the big W, is the why. Why do they need to know the material? Is it for regulatory purposes? Is it because of a change in processes? Is it going to make their lives easier? You want to focus on the why. And the one big question that I like to ask myself is, what's in it for me? Me being the member of the audience. Why should I take the time to learn this material? So remember the 5 W's of journalism to help you gather your information for your learning plan. So in summary, get everything in writing. Email is perfectly fine for that. And please make sure you keep your stakeholders in the loop. So if you're running late on something, let them know, because there's nothing worse than being surprised at the last minute by a delay when it could have been addressed a little bit sooner. So now that you've gathered your training project information, it's time to define the learning objectives. Basically, what you need to know. So that leads to step 2. Keep your eyes on the goal. So here's Gimli, my first kitty. When he was a kitten, he liked to try to reach up toward that plant. So he would do anything to try to reach that plant. So at first he would try to leap directly from the floor to the shelf, but that he couldn't reach it. Finally, he got smart and leapt up onto the couch. And then from the couch, he would stretch his paws right up to that shelf. So once he did so, he was finally able to get to that plant and knock it down. And luckily that was a fake plant, because if it had been real, that thing would have died a long time ago. So Gimli kept his eye on the goal, which was the plant, and he took small steps to do so. So how does this relate to developing training materials? Have your learning objectives. The first thing you need to do is define these learning objectives. It's basically, what do your learners need to know? Notice I said need, not nice to know or would like to know. What do they need to know to perform their job? So these learning objectives that you'll create serve as the driving force behind everything. And whatever materials don't align with these learning objectives are just extra. They're extra reference. When you're we'll go more into detail about some tips on creating learning objectives, but just consider the 80-20 rule, the Pareto rule. What will your learners spend 80% of their time doing? And that's what you want to focus on. I know some people will want to document every single little thing and every single little way, but basically you're probably not going to have that time to do so. So you want to focus on what's essential. So for example, in a course we developed about CBD for our pharmacists, we focused primarily on marijuana versus CBD and what they could and could not legally tell customers about the product. Because if you're not a pharmacist, you can't give medical advice. So we wanted to focus on that for that course. Now, once you answer that question, what do your learners need to know? You can then define your learning objectives. So basically, this is the part where you often see in courses, by the end of this course, you will be able to ... And this is where you fill in the ... Now, learning objectives must be specific, measurable, and tangible, that they can be seen, felt, and heard. So how can we create good, solid learning objectives? Here's some tips. Now, one of my favorite books that my father-in-law recommended this book called Preparing Instructional Objectives, Robert Major proposes these 3 questions you should ask yourself. First of all, what is the desired outcome? So in other words, what behavior needs to happen? 2, under what conditions must the action take place to achieve that desired outcome? And 3, what's considered success? That you perform something correctly X% of the time, or can at least do it? Let me give you an example. In the CBD course that we created, we wanted non-pharmacists to know what questions they could answer and which ones they needed to refer to the pharmacist. So our objective was, technician can answer non-medical questions about CBD and always recognize which questions to refer to the pharmacist. So in this example, the desired outcome was know what questions to answer and what not to answer. The conditions were the types of questions being thrown to them. And so success is medical questions were referred always 100% of the time. That was our definition of success for that particular objective. So when you're creating these objectives, another tip is to refer to Bloom's taxonomy. I could probably spend a whole session talking about this, but I just want to touch upon it for a brief moment. So you want to use specific actions, and Bloom's taxonomy provides a great category, different categories of verbs that you could use to define your specific actions. So in all of the different, levels from just remembering, understanding, applying, all the way to creating, I've provided a link within the presentation to so you can look at an example of all of these measurable verbs to use, and in these actions, from the simple act of remembering something to being able to synthesize that information and create something. So once you've defined your learning objectives, again, what you want your learners to know, it's time to start designing the course content. And so that leads us to step 3. Cats hate hats, so please keep things simple. I don't know too many cats who like wearing hats despite all the photos I've seen on Instagram. So years ago, a friend of mine gave me this cat bonnet. So I had all these visions of my cats wearing these bonnets and looking all sweet and innocent. Yeah, right. They look more like Venus flytraps there. So like Pepper, for example, he wore the cap fine. He didn't mind it. Buddy, he wore it, but he wasn't too happy. Sprinkles, on the other hand, I couldn't even get that cap on her head. So she thought it was a play toy. So she was like, no, don't put that on my head, Mama. No. So, so you want, when you're designing your training materials, you want to keep things simple. So what do I mean? And I can't say this enough. Cover only what your learners need to know, and refer back to your learning objectives when doing that. If it doesn't align, don't cover it. Now, you're going to have some stakeholders that are going to say, well, they do need to know this. I'd like them to know this. This is pretty cool information. So here's a compromise. Include non-essential information as reference material, because you're always going to have those learners who want to know more. And so you want to feed their curiosity. And so, for example, what we've done with this was we set up a page on our internal intranet site, and we would add links to various resources. And that way, people that wanted to know could always go back. But our training materials focus solely on what they needed to know. Just the basics, just the facts, like they say in Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. So how to keep your materials simple? Like I said earlier, build your own reference library. And then you want to make sure that you talk about this library. You can host it on your intranet, but just make sure your learners know about it. Make sure your learners know about it so that they can refer to it. And so you could put not just the reference materials, but also the training materials themselves. And again, and I'll say it a third time, make sure you focus on the objectives. So again, just, keep that laser focus. That way, most of your learners just want to know what they need to know. Just focus on that. It's kind of like what Lone Star told Princess Vespa in Spaceballs. Take only what you need to survive. I'm sure you're not going to need that great big hair dryer, despite what Princess Vespa may think. So speaking of keeping things simple, in the next step, we will learn some tips for making the information as simple as possible. So step 4, take small bites, don't gulp down your food. So never fails. Pepper, the big kitty in the middle, he eats sometimes he would eat so fast that he would cough it back up a few minutes later. And then right afterwards, he would go back to his or the other cat's food as if nothing had happened. But if Pepper ate slowly, like he's supposed to, he would not puke up his food. And the same goes for training. You want to make sure you present your information in small bites so that your learners don't get overwhelmed and end up losing their lunch over everything. So the main thing I want to talk about is chunking content. So if you present too much information to your learners at once, they're going to get overwhelmed and start tuning out. And this is known as cognitive overload. So when you're developing training, you want to break it down into smaller components, also known as chunking, to make it easier to digest. And chunking information goes hand in hand with making sure you present only the information that's covered in your objectives. So why should you chunk your information? It's easier for your learners to retain knowledge. That way you keep like information together and they're able to build upon their new and existing knowledge. It's easier when you're conducting on-demand or on-the-job learning. That way you keep things alike and you're able to focus just on that step right there, but you can always go back to it later on if need be. And finally, chunking makes it easier to update your materials. That way, instead of having to update the entire course, you only need to update a portion of it. So in summary, chunking your content into logical sections helps your learners avoid that cognitive overload. So what is chunking? It's not just breaking the information to smaller bits. It's the art of taking those bits and organizing them into a logical manner, dividing and organizing. So what's this logical manner? Let's find out on the next slide. So again, if you're arranging those bits, those bits of learning into logical manners, that's going to help your learners commit that information to their long-term memory. So how do you chunk? First of all, see how your information's already structured. Is there a chronological pattern? Are there different workstations that are involved? Now, one of the easiest areas to spot is procedural because that already goes step by step in order. So look at your information and see how it's structured. And as you break down your information, again, remove non-essential information. Focus only on what aligns with your objectives. So going back to our CBD course example, for the pharmacist training, because for this particular course, we created a module for pharmacists and one for non-pharmacists. For the pharmacist training, we included a section on chemical composition because they would find that information valuable when advising on product interactions. However, we did not cover it in the non-pharmacist training because they don't need to know that for their jobs, because they're not allowed to offer medical advice on medications. So make sure that you remove non-essential information for your particular audience. And step 3, when you've analyzed your information, cover one concept per chunk. So for example, in the CBD class we created, one section covered an overview on CBD and all the chemicals involved with it, while another chunk covered basic laws and regulations on what can and cannot be sold. So this is basically like your sections when you're sectioning things out. And finally, you want to group your related concepts together. So if learners can see how information relates with each other, then they can remember it better. So those are the 4 steps on how to chunk content. So in summary, you want to start from the big picture on down. So go ahead and look at everything, and then that will help you to organize it. You want to look for patterns in your information, whether it's chronological or by workstation or by section. Look for patterns. It's unique for each project. And don't just divide the content into little pieces. You got to rearrange it. That's the art of chunking. It's not like, it's kind of like in Willy Wonka where he, Mike TV is transported in a million tiny pieces. All those tiny pieces don't mean anything, but once they're put together, they either constitute that candy bar that Willy Wonka transported or Mike TV. So you've got to rearrange the pieces to make them logical. They're useless on their own. So here's some more chunking examples. So like you can have multiple modules within your training. So like different chapters, different sections. You can have one topic videos. Now, one good rule of thumb was 4 minutes or less, but if you can make that even less, that'd be even more wonderful. In fact, think about TikTok. You have like 60 seconds to, do your video. So you can think in terms of that. Now, of course, not everything can be distilled into 60 seconds, but if you can, you want to just focus on the essentials and just, boil down to the basics. Or you can even use animated GIFs to showcase in action. And again, we're just highlighting different things you can do. We can easily spend different sessions talking about each of these items, but I just want to get, whet your appetite for these. And of course, having a variety of activities and using a variety of media and, mix up activities. So, I want to give an example for this. So when we developed health screening device training, we focused on one piece of equipment at a time. So we would talk about that device first and what it tested for, then we would demonstrate how to use it, and then finally gave students a chance to practice. That way, they became more comfortable in using the item. So now that you have your content, you want to prepare to have your change strategy available. This is because course content will not remain constant. It'll change. So you want to make sure that your materials are as easy to update as possible so that they remain relevant. So here's the kitty story involved with preparing for change. So we've had the privilege of watching our baby kittens grow up into majestic cats. So for the most part, the grown cats like Sprinkles here, the black and white kitty, she looks pretty much the same as an adult from when she was a kitten. However, some of our cats, such as Gimli, changed drastically. So believe it or not, that's the same cat. So when he was a kitten, he had that cream colored body with a dark tail and dark ears. And then over the course of about 3 or 4 years, he started developing a darker back, a ruff around his neck, and tabby marks and everything. So he looks like a totally different cat right there. So just as kittens change into cats, so must you consider how to handle changes in your course materials. So first of all, you want to use ubiquitous utensils, tools that are readily available and simple to use. I find nothing wrong with using Word, PowerPoint, PDFs, and so forth. So, but even if you use more sophisticated software like Captivate, Camtasia, or what have you, just make sure that the party who's in charge of updates has access to that tool so that they can update as needed, because there's nothing worse than using this, it's a cool but unusual tool to build training, but if you can't update it or make any changes, it's not as good. Now, speaking of updates, again, if you don't already have one, make sure you have a plan for who's responsible for handling updates. Most of the time it's you, but if it's someone else, make sure that all parties involved know how course updates will be handled. And of course, they'll develop the strategy or use what you already have in place for course review and updates and so forth. And I see there's probably some questions here, but I think the way that the presentation is, it's kind of hard for me to see the chat, but I'll go ahead and address any questions towards the end. That way it's a little bit easier. And that way I get everyone covered. So in summary, when you're making your materials easy to update and distribute, chunk your content. Again, that way you only have to update one section versus the whole shebang. And don't be afraid of simple tools, because some people will think, oh, PowerPoint, no. Sometimes simplest is best. It's the information that's important, not necessarily the delivery mechanism. So that's, regarding change. Now, I think at this point right here, if there are any questions, I can go ahead and address them before we move on to the next section. That might be a little bit, because I think I figured out how to do the chat. Or maybe not. Y'all see?
Most of our questions.
I'm sorry?
Most of our questions are just about making comments, talking about, Anne says that her cat does the wolfing the food down. And we just had a question if we were recording, and yes, we are.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So we're actually about 2/3 of the way through. So now we get to step 6, embracing playtime and digging right in. And so when I first got Gimli in 2002, I bought this really cool rollerball toy that has the little scratcher in the middle and the little ball that goes around. So he enjoyed playing with that toy. And throughout the years, even as recently as right now, all of our kitties have enjoyed that toy. There's Big Pepper and Little Sprinkles. They've enjoyed the toy. Even Buddy, and now Piggy. And all I've had to do really was replace the inside core of the, the little scratcher part, but they've always enjoyed playing with that ball. So just as the kitties embrace playtime, it's time for you to dig right in as you're creating your training activities. So some examples of training content. And of course, this all depends on, what you want to cover and what kind of time. I mean, of course, you have a lot of, you have some limitations, but I just want to throw at you some examples of things that you can do and some strategies on when to use them. So first of all, we have lecture. Lectures are great for introducing a topic. This is one-way communication. You're feeding information to your audience. And Mind Tools suggests 30 minutes or less for a lecture. And you want to summarize the important parts at the beginning and the end. So have some sort of structure. That way you give some sort of introduction to your topic. Now, of course, you don't have to do all these activities. These are just examples of what you can integrate. You, of course, you can have a demonstration. This is where if you need to show procedures on how to do something. So this is where you show the steps, and you can do this live. You can do this, right next to the person if you're, doing on-the-job training, or you can show it through pictures. However, but the main thing with demonstration is you're showing someone how to do something. And this could even be, software simulation. If you're showing, how to input a prescription in our prescription system, or how to indicate how to add insurance to the system, for example. Now, as opposed to a lecture, you also have a discussion. Unlike a lecture, discussion is two-way. And this discussions are great because you can handle it through various media. So you could do it through chats on social media, or even if we're meeting like this through Zoom, I could talk, and then, you can talk, we both talk. You can even do this, even if you're live, back when we're able to meet live, you can even do it within that setting. But basically, the difference between a discussion and a lecture is that discussions are two-way, lectures one-way. We also have online learning. So this is where you can do software practice, And this is where you can use tools like Snagit and Captivate and what have you to learn how to use a certain piece of software. And online learning is also a great way of grouping chunked media. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a group of videos that you want your learners to view. You can use this shell like Captivate to plug in your videos along with explanatory information. That way the videos are housed inside the course shell. So you can do that, and you can, you know, add additional information. And we could talk, I mean, this, again, this could be a topic for a whole nother discussion, but you have that option of grouping your media together to form a cohesive unit. And you can also incorporate role play scenarios and feedback. Like, for example, this is especially good for customer service. You want to, everyone loves to play the bad guy once in a while. So give, you know, that scenario of disgruntled customer, and then of course give a specific scenario that they're mad that they can't get their refill on their narcotics. So you want to be the role play, it's not just to have fun, but it serves a purpose in that you know how to handle various situations in a professional and effective manner. And of course, you know, feedback, you get feedback on whatever it is that you do. So these are just some activities that you can incorporate into training. And again, these are just for, you know, quick training courses. But I just wanted to include this information. So here's some reminders when creating your course content. You want to include a variety of activities, because you don't want to be like the teacher in Ferris Bueller where he's just going, Bueller, Bueller, Bueller. You don't want to dull your audience. You want to engage them with a variety of activities. You also want to appeal to as many senses as possible. Obviously, you can't taste a Zoom call, but you can see, you can hear, and you can, you know, see and hear, and, you know, try to get, you know, well, you probably could incorporate taste if you were doing a cooking demo and invited people to bring their food as they went along. You could do that. I think the thing is just to think outside the box and think how you could incorporate that. It may take some planning on both parties' parts, but you can appeal to multiple senses through whatever media you're using. And finally, know your limits, but still reach for the stars, meaning obviously, you know, you have, you know, to consider time, you have to consider how, you know, your budget. A lot of times for these quick courses, you're not going to have much budget at all. So you may have to have something that's as simple as a checklist or what have you. But, you know, try to make, you know, things as engaging as possible for your learners so that they can get that experience. So speaking of experience, where pertinent, you want to give practice opportunity. Practice, practice, practice. So here's Gimli, my first kitty, you know, who started my obsession for cats. And when he was first diagnosed with diabetes, I had to learn how to inject him with insulin. I'd never before used a needle syringe, and I was afraid of hurting my poor cat. So to get me accustomed to the process, the veterinarian had me practice injecting water into an orange. Now this sounded weird, but this was actually because the orange best simulates skin, the texture and the thickness. So once I became comfortable with pushing the syringe plunger, withdrawing the water, and then injecting it into the orange, the vet then showed me how to hold Gimli down so that I could, you know, give him the shot. And so obviously my first few times were quite nerve-wracking because, again, I was holding Gimli, he could sense my fear, and I was scared. But over time, we both became comfortable with the whole process. And it even got to the point to where within a couple of months, all I had to do was find Gimli at his food dish. I didn't even have to hold him. I just, you know, gently held him on his back, bloop, did the injection right where he was standing. So when you practice something over time, you become confident, and your recipients can sense that confidence as well. So, about practice. Where pertinent, you want to incorporate practice opportunities, and these can include such activities as simulations, role play, and hands-on exercises. And you can also encourage practice outside the course with reference materials. So even if you have them doing something outside of the training class or the training time, you can, offer ideas on what to do outside. One of my favorite things to do are assessment checklists because they serve multiple purposes and they help summarize what it is you need to know. And I'll provide an example of an assessment checklist on another slide. But I do want to give you an example on some practice opportunities, even when we don't have the time to practice it live or even through video. So going back to our CBD e-learning courses that we created, we didn't have the resources at the time to create a role play scenario video clip of a customer asking a non-pharmacist a medical question. But what we did do instead was build in a branching question to where we presented the scenario on the slide and then offered different options and then gave feedback depending on what option the user selected. So even if you can't have that live interaction, you could still kind of simulate it with Q&A with the multiple choice questions and the feedback mechanisms of whatever software you're using or whatever it is that you're using to put together your materials. So here's an example of an assessment checklist. So in this sample checklist, we had our trainers assess whether or not our health screeners know how to perform specific screenings. So we listed so we had the different categories and then the criteria, and then under the explanation, this is what you needed to look for, and then they would be able to check yes or no. And as you can see here, you can use the checklist either at electronic or print it out. I think here we had to print it out because we didn't have the tools at the time to create an online tool. But as you can see, this checklist is great not only for the trainer to see, oh, this is the behavior that you need to perform, or these are the behaviors, but it's also useful for the learner because they can see what it is they need to know and what behaviors they need to do. So when they're applying that cuff, okay, these are the things that I need to do in order to make sure that it's on correctly, that, my sleeves are rolled up, that my cuff is on this arm, and so forth. So assessment checklists are a great way not only to assess performance, but also provide extra education for the end user. So in summary, when you're building in practice opportunities, if you have the luxury of having some sort of group demonstration or practice, always allow for extra time, not just for the time for the activity, but also time for explaining it, perhaps giving an example, and more importantly, giving people time to transition out and into the activity, because I know we're all excited after we do this, so we've got to settle back down and go on to the next section. So build in, more time than what you think is needed. And then if you happen to not have to use that extra time, that's extra time that you have for anything else or early release. And when you're building in a practice opportunity, focus on the most complex and most commonly used items. Don't devote practice to some obscure step that you're only going to use once, because that's not the most effective use of your time. Instead, if you know that they're going to do something repeatedly, and if it's something that's kind of hard, you want to focus on that. That way they get used to you doing that action, and that way it becomes second nature instead of something that's like, oh my gosh, what do I do? But the most important thing, don't do practice just because. Don't use it as a time waster or a time filler, because time is precious and we don't want to waste our time doing something that is not valuable to us. So again, make sure that it aligns with your learning objectives. So moving on to feedback, step 8. Okay, I don't know about you, but during this pandemic, we've been putting together a lot of jigsaw puzzles, and I love jigsaw puzzles, but the cats love them even more, especially when they have pieces they can scatter to the ground. So I built this board out of red foam board with borders. So when I was working on a puzzle some time back, Buddy right here was perched on top of the tray. So obviously he's not supposed to be there. So when I spotted him there, and I just gotten up for a couple seconds to go grab a soda from the fridge, I come back and find him right there. So what I did was I took the squirt bottle, I shook it, and the moment he heard that water shake, he ran right off. I didn't even have to squirt him. So that was his feedback for knowing that he wasn't supposed to be on that puzzle, and he ran straight off. Now, Pepper, on the other hand,
in many cases, it works faster and greater.
he was a good boy. Pepper was a good boy in that he stayed off the puzzle and he responded. We're just hearing a little bit of background noise. Yeah. So now we have Pepper, on the other hand. He was a good kitty. He stayed off this. So I told him, good boy for staying on the ground, and I gave him a couple of treats as a reward. So love and praise, but use the squirt gun when needed, or at least shake it. So feedback is important for a course because it lets you know certain things. So why do you give feedback to a learner? It reinforces good behavior and it can help reduce not so good behavior. Now, what constitutes good feedback? It's immediate or as immediate as possible. That way you tie the feedback to the activity. It's also specific. So instead of just saying good job or awesome, you want to know why you're awesome, or you don't just say that was bad. No, you don't say that's bad. You want to explain why something's bad. And that leads to the third point. Make sure good feedback is focused on the behavior and not on the person. You don't want to shame them. You don't want to call someone bad. You just want to call out that an action was not so good and why it wasn't so good, because that's how we learn. How else are we going to know that, we weren't supposed to do something? So again, we're going back to the performance evaluation checklist. This is a good way of getting feedback on how you're able to do something successfully. So I just wanted to present this as an example of how you can evaluate someone and how you can give them constructive feedback. And just a little, some kitty treats, some reminders. Make sure your feedback is immediate and specific. You want to make sure you focus on the behavior and not on the person, because you want them to be able to learn from their mistakes, learn from, what they did. And finally, you want to make sure your evaluations align with the learning objectives. So this should be obvious, but you want to focus on making sure your learner does what you want them to do. And meaningful feedback helps the learner know not only what they did correctly, but also what they need to work on. So your course is pretty much ready for action, ready for sharing, uploading, however, you're going to distribute it. So once your course is out, your last step is taking a cat nap. So you rest, but remain alert. And this means that you can't necessarily lay on your laurels, but you're ready to take action when necessary. So most of the time, cats will sleep with one eye open, so they look like they're resting, but they're actually ready to plot their next attack. And they'll spring into action when they hear the rattle of the cat food bag, or when I pop open that wet food can or shake the treats. So what's your action? Your one action to prepare for is preparing for course feedback. Why course feedback? Well, 3 reasons. Helps improve the quality of your course and materials. It helps you improve your development skills, helps trainers improve their training skills. And most importantly, it helps you identify any areas for improvement. So do you need to cover some items in greater detail? Do you need to cover some items in less detail, or remove it altogether? Course evaluations help answer that question. Now, I want to give you an example of an easy peasy course evaluation survey. And in fact, you're going to see this example right after this because I've borrowed this from our SIG's webinar evaluation. So the course evaluation can be as simple as asking these 3 questions, which again, I've borrowed from our own webinar survey. Name one thing you learned that you can apply. List one thing you liked about the course. And list one thing you would change about the course. And I like question number 3 especially because it's worded positively. It doesn't say dislike because then it would become a gripe fest. So instead, we offer you to offer what you would like to change. And that way, there's more of a chance that you would give some constructive feedback versus merely complaining. Now, of course, I mean, some people can and will complain, but you want to make sure that whatever feedback you get is valuable to you. So 3 simple questions, and even though they're free-form answers, that's still more valuable feedback than just, a ratings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, you can still incorporate that, but what I'm saying is you can keep your course evaluation super simple. And in fact, here's some tips for inviting responses. First of all, you want to make sure that you help maintain anonymity because some people are more comfortable giving feedback when you can't trace it back to them. Now, of course, if people want to be available to talk or to explain, of course, they'll have that option. But there are some people that just want to give it without while remaining anonymous. So have that mechanism. Also, you want to make sure your survey is distributed by the end of the training. That way, if you wait, a few days, people are going to forget what they want to give you feedback on. So you want to make sure you have your survey questions ready to go. That way, right when you distribute the course, that way they have that right in front of you. And keep it short and sweet because there's nothing worse than you're going to be tempted to ask all these different questions. And a lot of times, and myself included, if I see a survey that's a little bit long, I'm going to tell myself, oh, I'll fill this out later. And you know what happens when you tell yourself you'll fill it out later? You'll forget it. So if you keep it short and sweet from the get-go, you'll say, oh, I've got a minute. This will take me just a minute to do this. And so you'll be more inclined to offer your feedback. So you may not necessarily ask every single question under the sun, but at least you'll be able to get the essential questions. And so every situation is unique, but if you want to see some sample questions and best practices, visit this link right here. That's in the slides. And also visit SurveyMonkey or similar tools for question templates. Other people have done the work and then you can, borrow from them. That's how we all, learn. We see things that other people have built and we use them and adapt them to our own purposes. And so in summary, you want to gather your information, prepare for the new arrival. Yeah, gather your information about your training course or materials. Next, you want to define your learning objectives, what your learners need to know. You also want to keep things as simple as possible. Focus only on what they need to know versus what they would like to know. Make sure you chunk your content into manageable pieces to help your learners retain the information. You also want to have an update strategy, plan for updates, who's going to update it and how. That way you keep your information fresh and relevant. Then you want to actually create the course. Think about the activities you want to incorporate. Think about how much time you have you may not necessarily want to do every fancy thing under the sun, but you create your content in your deliverables. When pertinent, allow for practice opportunity. Even if it's something as simple as, okay, show me what I just did, whether it's one-on-one or if you're with a group of people, allow for practice whenever pertinent. Next, as your learners are taking the course, offer feedback on their performance, or if they have, as they have questions, answer them. But you want to make sure your feedback is specific and useful. And finally, be prepared to receive feedback. Evaluate the effectiveness of your materials and celebrate, because you've just done a really big task in sharing your knowledge and sharing knowledge with other people. So this quote pretty much summarizes what our experience about learning is. And I'll read this to you. Learning shouldn't be a one-time event. Instead, it should be an evolving and adaptive process that creates a unique and personalized experience for each learner. I take that to heart, and I'd like you to be able to take that to heart as well. So here's my contact information. Here's my personal email and my work email. I'm also on Twitter, and those are underscores. My LinkedIn, so I'd love to hear from you. And my slide share, I want to update my slide, even though the content of the slides is up to date. The only cosmetic change I made since then was including pictures of the new kitty, Piggy, because when I originally gave this presentation, we only had 3 cats. Now we have 4. And so on behalf of the kitties, Pepper, Buddy, Sprinkles, Piggy, and our angels, Gimli, Keekers, and Mittens, thank you so much for joining me today. And so if you have any questions, we have some time to address them.
So no questions in the chat yet, but everybody has microphone rights. You can turn your microphone on.
Hi, everybody. This
And
is
speak
Mary
up.
Ann Bowen. Just a comment. I heartily endorse preparing instructional objectives. I think that might have been one of the smallest texts I ever used, but arguably the most valuable from
I agree.
my entire education.
Thank you. Yes. And in fact, I had discovered that book when we were going through my father-in-law's books. Well, I never got to know him. He passed away years ago, even before I met my husband. But that book was within his collection. And so I was thumbing through it. And then it was referenced by another article that I was reading for some other, educational webinar. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, that book sounds familiar. So I grabbed it from the shelf, and sure enough, so even though the version I have is like one of the original ones, I love the style of it. It kind of reminds me of a choose your own adventure book. That's what it reminds me of. So it was great to go through, and it was educational. And I think it's timeless, because even though the book was written over 50 years ago, it's timeless.
I thought your presentation was just awesome. It just was a great refresher thing for me. And my question was, how often or how strongly do you use themes like cats, or not necessarily cats, but things like that in the training? So.
Do you mean like how often I incorporate that, or?
Incorporate some sort of theme.
I like to include themes whenever I'm instructing about it or sharing my knowledge about it. I pretty much almost all the time, because it kind of gives that base, and it's also makes the information fun. So I've done the same thing with Harry Potter, and I've even done the same thing with knitting for Lightning Talk back in 2016 Summit. And even though I only had like 5 minutes to talk about technical communication with knitting, I just like to relate different things to help spark that desire and that whole relation, because I think that if you're able to relate things, you know, find that relationship, that information will stick with you more. So I always like to include other things whenever possible when educating people about what I've learned over the years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you dealt with different age groups as well as
Age groups, primarily adults. I did teach for 1 year 7th graders, and I've taught Sunday school to kindergartners and 2nd graders, but the difference was more of the teaching. The curriculum was already developed because we used the whatever manuals, but in terms of instructional design, I've primarily just dealt with adults.
Okay, thank you.
And luckily, none of them have ever acted like children. So I've had the privilege of dealing with very receptive audiences because they want to learn. And usually the people that I teach, well, I mean, I haven't really done any training because we do have trainers in our within our department. So they're the ones that deliver the training, but I'm more behind the scenes. But in the times that I have delivered training from the trainer perspective, they've all been excited and wanted to be there.
Thanks, Jamie. This is Ann Freeman in Johnson City, Tennessee. I always appreciate your presentations, and they're always very personable and relatable and
Thank you.
practical.
Thank you, Ann.
Mhm.
I'll second that.
Oh dear.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Melissa. I'll just stop sharing for right now so I can see everybody, because that's the only drawback of again not having 2 screens. I can't see everyone's faces while I'm giving the presentation. But now and even if I'm seeing mostly like people's names and everything, it still gives that more personal touch. Oh, I see. Oh, Lynn's got a kitty cat.
Oh.
It kind of looks like Gimli.
Oh,
Hi.
I shut him off. Let's see.
Oh,
There. Is he on? Yeah, he's like Gimli. He's not quite as furry, but he's a lynx point.
oh, he's adorable.
Thanks. He's my helper.
Oh, and actually, if I turn off my virtual background, you'll be able to see Pepper. He just happens to be the cat that's closest by.
Oh,
Yeah,
he
he was.
so cute.
Thank you. Yeah, he was napping on the chair next to me the whole time.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording and then we can chat.